The blood came first, dark and wet against the dusk sky as Morgan Keller rode hard toward Eureka Springs, Arkansas. The year was 1879, and he was running out of time. His left shoulder burned with each gallop of his Mustang, the bullet lodged somewhere beneath muscle and sinew. Behind him, the setting sun cast long shadows across the Ozark foothills, painting everything in shades of amber and blood. He needed shelter, needed help, needed someone who wouldn't ask too many questions about why a man might be riding in with a gunshot wound as twilight descended. Faith Miller had seen plenty of desperate cases since taking over her father's medical practice 2 years prior, but rarely did they arrive on horseback, barely conscious and bleeding through their shirt. She'd been closing up for the night when the commotion outside her small clinic at the edge of town drew her attention. The man nearly fell from his saddle, catching himself on the hitching post with his good arm. "Sir," she called, stepping onto the porch, her medical bag already in hand. "Sir, are you hurt?" Morgan looked up, vision swimming. He hadn't expected a woman, especially not one so young, barely into her 20s, he guessed, with eyes that reminded him of a clear autumn sky. "Been shot," he managed to say, his voice a dry rasp. "Didn't know where else to go." Faith was beside him in an instant, slipping under his uninjured right arm to support him. "Inside, now." Her voice brooked no argument as she guided him toward the door. "You're lucky I haven't locked up yet." "Lucky ain't the word I'd use, madam," Morgan muttered, wincing as they crossed the threshold into the modest clinic. The place was simple but impeccably clean, with a small examining table in the center of the main room. "My name is Faith Miller. I'm the doctor here," she said, helping him to sit on the table. "And you are," Morgan hesitated. Names meant questions, and questions were dangerous, but something in the steady determination of her gaze made him answer truthfully. "Morgan Keller." "Well, Mr. Keller, let's see what we're dealing with." Faith's fingers moved to the buttons of his blood-soaked shirt, professional and efficient. "I need to know what happened." "Does it matter?" he asked through gritted teeth as she eased the fabric away from the wound. Faith paused, meeting his eyes directly. "Yes, Mr. Keller, it does. Bullet wounds aren't accidents. They come with pursuers. I need to know if I should be expecting company." Morgan sighed, wincing as the motion jarred his shoulder. "Not immediately, lost them about 10 miles back." He studied her face for a moment. "You're mighty young to be a doctor." Faith's lips tightened as she examined the wound. "I'm 24, and I've been assisting my father since I was 12. He taught me everything he knew before consumption took him." She reached for her scissors to cut away more of his shirt. "The bullet's still in there." "I figured as much," Morgan replied, watching her work. There was something reassuring about her movements, confident, precise. "You've done this before. More times than I care to count." Faith turned to retrieve her instruments from a nearby cabinet. "This is going to hurt. I don't have much chloroform left, but I can give you whiskey." Morgan shook his head. "Save your supplies. I've been through worse." Faith frowned but didn't argue. She lit several oil lamps, positioning them around the table to provide better illumination as the last rays of daylight faded outside. "I'll need to get that bullet out before infection sets in. Hold still." As she worked, Morgan studied the slight furrow between her brows as she concentrated, the stray curl of honey blonde hair that escaped her practical bun, the steadiness of her hands as she probed the wound. Despite the pain, he found himself oddly captivated. "You're not from around here," she observed, not looking up from her work. Morgan grunted in affirmation. "Been riding circuit, ranch to ranch wherever there's work to be had. A cowhand, then? Among other things." Faith glanced up briefly, her eyes narrowing. "The men who shot you, why did they do it?" Morgan's jaw tightened. "Difference of opinion. About what?" "About whether a man should stand by and watch when something ain't right." The words came out harsher than he intended, and he saw her hands pause momentarily before resuming their work. "I need to get this bullet out now," she said, reaching for a pair of long forceps. "Brace yourself." Morgan nodded, grasping the edge of the table with his good hand. The pain, when it came, was white-hot and all-consuming. He bit down on the inside of his cheek until he tasted blood, determined not to cry out. Faith worked methodically, her concentration absolute as she probed for the bullet. "Almost got it," she murmured, and then, with a slight metallic sound, the forceps withdrew, a misshapen lump of lead clasped between them. She dropped the bullet into a small metal basin with a soft clink. "There. Now for the hard part." Morgan raised an eyebrow. "That wasn't the hard part." Faith's lips quirked into the smallest hint of a smile as she threaded a needle. "Now I have to close you up before you bleed to death on my examining table. That would be terribly inconvenient for my morning appointments." Despite everything, Morgan found himself chuckling, then immediately regretted it as pain lanced through his shoulder. "Wouldn't want to put you out, madam." Faith worked in silence for several minutes, her needle moving in and out with practiced precision. The lantern light cast a warm glow over her features, softening them. For a moment, Morgan almost forgot the circumstances that had brought him here. "Who taught you to stitch like that?" he asked, partly out of genuine curiosity and partly to distract himself from the sensation of the needle passing through his flesh. "My father, as I said. Before him, my grandmother was a midwife. Healing runs in the family." Faith tied off a stitch, her movements economical. "Though I'm the first with formal training. 2 years at the Women's Medical College in Philadelphia." Morgan whistled low. "Impressive. Most folks around here probably don't take kindly to a woman doctor." "Some don't," Faith acknowledged, her voice matter of fact. "Others are simply grateful for any medical care at all. Eureka Springs has its fair share of ailments between the mining accidents, saloon brawls, and the usual fevers and childbirth." She glanced up at him. "What about you, Mr. Keller? Do you object to being treated by a woman?" Morgan met her gaze steadily. "Seems to me a steady hand and a sharp mind matter more than what a person's wearing." Faith held his gaze for a moment longer than necessary before returning to her work. "You'd be surprised how many disagree with that assessment." "Not really," Morgan replied. "People fear what they don't understand, and most men don't understand women who step outside the roles they're assigned." Faith's hands stilled for a fraction of a second. "That's unusually perceptive, Mr. Keller." "Morgan," he corrected. "And I've seen enough of the world to know stupidity when I encounter it." The room fell silent again save for the quiet hiss of the lanterns and the distant sounds of nighttime in a small frontier town piano music drifting from the saloon down the street, the occasional shout or laugh. Faith continued her careful stitching, and Morgan found himself studying the play of light on her features, the intent concentration in her eyes. "Almost done," she murmured after a while. "You're fortunate the bullet missed anything vital." "I've been shot worse," Morgan replied, then added more softly as their eyes met, "but never cared more." Faith's hands faltered for just a moment, a slight flush rising to her cheeks before she regained her composure. "Well, Mr. Keller Morgan, I'd prefer if you'd avoid getting shot at all in the future." "I'll take that under advisement, Doc," he said, the corner of his mouth lifting in a half-smile. Faith finished the last stitch and tied it off neatly. "You'll need to rest. That shoulder needs time to heal, and you've lost blood." She hesitated, clearly weighing her next words. "Do you have somewhere to stay in town?" Morgan shook his head. "Hadn't gotten that far in my planning." Faith sighed, wiping her hands on a clean cloth. "There are rooms above the saloon, but that's no place for a man with a fresh wound. Too much noise, too much dust." She seemed to come to a decision. "I have a spare room upstairs. You can stay there tonight where I can keep an eye on you for fever." Morgan raised his eyebrows. "That's mighty generous, but won't it cause talk? A single woman taking in a stranger." Faith's expression turned wry. "Mr. Keller, I'm already the scandal of Eureka Springs, an unmarried woman practicing medicine. One more transgression hardly matters." She began packing away her instruments. "Besides, this is a medical decision. I've taken in patients before when necessary." "If you're sure," Morgan said, though the thought of riding any further tonight made his shoulder throb in protest. I am. Can you walk, or do you need help? Morgan slid carefully off the table, testing his balance. The room swayed slightly, but he remained upright. I can manage, Faith nodded, gathering a few supplies and extinguishing all but one lantern. This way, then. She led him through a door at the back of the clinic into a small but tidy living area, then up a narrow staircase. The upper floor contained 2 bedrooms and a small sitting room. Faith showed him to the smaller of the bedrooms, which held a narrow bed, a nightstand, and a plain wooden chair. It's not much, she said, setting the lantern down on the nightstand, but it's clean. It's more than enough, Morgan assured her. Thank you. Faith hesitated in the doorway. I'll bring you some water and something for the pain. You should try to sleep. After she left, Morgan eased himself onto the edge of the bed, wincing as his shoulder protested. He hadn't planned on Eureka Springs being anything more than a brief stop on his journey, yet here he was, shot, and being tended by the most intriguing woman he'd encountered in years. Faith returned with a glass of water and a small brown bottle. Laudanum, she explained, just a few drops. It will help with the pain. Morgan accepted both with a nod of thanks. I appreciate all this, he said quietly. Not many would take in a stranger with a bullet wound. Perhaps I'm a poor judge of character, Faith replied, though her tone suggested she didn't believe that. Or perhaps I believe in helping those in need, regardless of circumstance. And which is it in this case? Faith studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable in the lantern light. I haven't decided yet, Mr. Keller. Rest now. We'll talk more in the morning. After she left, closing the door softly behind her, Morgan carefully removed his boots and lay back on the bed. The laudanum dulled the worst of the pain, but his mind remained alert, replaying the events that had led him here. The cattle barons hired guns, the family about to lose their homestead, his intervention that had gone so wrong. And now this, an unexpected sanctuary with a woman doctor whose eyes seemed to see right through him. Sleep, when it finally came, was filled with dreams of blood and dust, broken by flashes of clear blue eyes and steady hands stitching him back together under the warm glow of lantern light. Faith rose before dawn, her sleep having been fitful at best. Her patient Morgan had occupied her thoughts far more than was professional. There was something about him that intrigued her beyond the medical curiosity of his wound. Perhaps it was the way he looked at her, without the usual condescension or discomfort she'd grown accustomed to from men encountering a female physician. Or perhaps it was simply that he was handsome in a rough-hewn way, with eyes that seemed to have seen too much. She checked on him first thing, finding him asleep but restless, his brow furrowed even in slumber. His skin was warm to the touch, but not alarmingly so, no sign of infection yet, which was a blessing. She changed his bandage carefully, trying not to wake him, but his eyes flew open at her touch, instantly alert. Easy, she said softly. It's just me. Morgan relaxed marginally, watching as she examined his wound. Verdict, Doc? Healing well so far, no signs of infection. Faith secured the fresh bandage. How's the pain? Manageable, he replied, though the tightness around his eyes suggested otherwise. Faith nodded, not pushing the issue. Men like Morgan Keller rarely admitted to pain. I need to open the clinic soon, but there's coffee downstairs when you're ready and some bread and preserves. Morgan started to sit up, wincing slightly. I should be moving on. Not today, Faith said firmly. That shoulder needs at least a day or two of rest before you subject it to horseback riding, unless you're in a particular hurry to undo my handiwork. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. When you put it that way, no. Good. Faith gathered her supplies. Rest today, doctor's orders. Despite her instruction, she wasn't surprised to find Morgan downstairs in her small kitchen an hour later, dressed and sipping coffee with his good arm. He'd managed to wash up and had even attempted to shave, though he'd missed a spot near his jawline. Most patients don't ignore my advice quite so quickly, Faith remarked, pouring herself a cup of coffee. Morgan had the grace to look slightly abashed. Never was much good at lying around. Faith shook her head but didn't press the issue. I've got appointments starting soon. You're welcome to stay up here, away from curious eyes. Hiding me away, Doc? There was a hint of amusement in his voice. Protecting my reputation, she countered, though they both knew that wasn't the whole truth. And yours, I imagine whoever shot you might still be looking. Morgan's expression sobered. All the more reason I shouldn't linger. At least give that shoulder today, Faith insisted. You can leave tomorrow if you're determined. Morgan studied her over the rim of his cup. Why are you helping me, Doc? You don't know anything about me. For all you know, I could be the villain in this story. Faith considered the question seriously. I've treated enough men to develop a sense for their character. The villains rarely worry about compromising a lady's reputation. She set down her cup. Besides, you took a bullet defending someone, didn't you? That's what you meant about not standing by when something isn't right. Morgan looked away, uncomfortable with her insight. Maybe. That tells me enough, Faith said simply. She glanced at the clock on the wall. I need to open the clinic. Try not to tear those stitches. The morning passed quickly with a steady stream of patients, a minor with a persistent cough, a young mother with a colicky infant, an elderly man with joint pain. Faith worked methodically, her mind occasionally straying to the man upstairs. When the flow of patients ebbed around midday, she went to check on him, half expecting him to have disregarded her advice entirely and disappeared. Instead, she found him on the small back porch, sitting in the lone rocking chair and watching the hills beyond the town. He turned at her approach, and something in his expression made her heart beat a little faster. How's business, Doc? He asked. The usual ailments, Faith replied, leaning against the porch railing. Nothing as exciting as a gunshot wound. Thank goodness for small mercies, Morgan said dryly. Faith studied him, noticing the way he held himself carefully to avoid jarring his shoulder. You should be resting. I am resting. Just doing it out here where I can see what's coming. The implication was clear he was still concerned about pursuit. No one's come asking after a wounded stranger, Faith assured him. Not yet, Morgan said, his gaze returning to the hills. But they will. Men like Randall Wade don't take kindly to interference. Randall Wade, Faith's brow furrowed. The cattle baron from over near Fayetteville? Morgan looked at her sharply. You know him. By reputation only, he's been buying up land all through this part of Arkansas. Faith crossed her arms. What did you do to cross him? Morgan was silent for a long moment. He's been forcing small homesteaders out, claiming their land under false pretenses or outright intimidation. I was hired as security for a family he was targeting, the Johnsons. Good people, working land they legally homesteaded 5 years ago. And Wade wanted it. Wade always wants more, Morgan said bitterly. His men came 3 nights ago, meant to scare the Johnsons off or worse. I intervened. There was a fight. I managed to drive them back, but not before catching this. He gestured to his shoulder. And the Johnsons? Safe for now. I made sure of that before I left, but Wade's men were on my trail. Couldn't lead them back to the family. Faith absorbed this, a new understanding of the man before her taking shape. So you're running to draw them away. Something like that, Morgan agreed, though I hadn't planned on getting shot in the process. Faith smiled slightly. Few people do, Mr. Keller. They fell into a companionable silence, watching as a hawk circled lazily over the distant trees. There was something comforting about sharing this moment of quiet, Faith realized, something that felt strangely familiar despite having known this man less than a day. You could report Wade to the authorities, she suggested eventually. Morgan laughed, a short, humorless sound. The sheriff in Fayetteville, he's in Wade's pocket, and the federal marshals have bigger concerns than land disputes. So what will you do? Morgan shrugged his good shoulder. Keep moving, find work elsewhere, what I always do. That sounds lonely, Faith observed softly. Something flickered in Morgan's eyes, a brief glimpse of vulnerability quickly masked. It's simpler that way. Before Faith could respond, the bell above her clinic door jingled, signaling a patient's arrival. "I should go," she said, reluctant to end their conversation. Morgan nodded. "Don't let me keep you from your work, Doc." As Faith turned to leave, he added, "Thank you, not just for the stitches." Faith glanced back, a small smile touching her lips. "You're welcome, Morgan, not just for the stitches." The afternoon brought a steady flow of patients, keeping Faith busy until well past her usual closing time. By the time she locked the clinic door, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the dusty main street of Eureka Springs. She was exhausted, but satisfied with the day's work. When she entered her living quarters, she was surprised to find the small table set for dinner, a pot of something that smelled remarkably good simmering on the stove. "Hope you don't mind," Morgan said from where he was awkwardly stirring the pot with his good arm. "Figured you might be hungry after a long day." Faith stood in the doorway, momentarily speechless. It had been years since anyone had cooked for her, not since her father's death. "You didn't have to do that. Least I could do," Morgan replied. "It's just a simple stew, found some vegetables in your garden, patch out back, and a bit of salt pork in your pantry. Nothing fancy." Faith moved into the kitchen, inhaling the savory aroma. "It smells wonderful." She glanced at his shoulder. "Though you shouldn't be using that arm." "I managed," Morgan said, stepping back from the stove. "Sit. You look dead on your feet." Too tired to argue, Faith sank into one of the kitchen chairs. Morgan ladled stew into 2 bowls and placed one before her, then sat across the small table. The domesticity of the scene struck Faith, suddenly how natural it felt to share a meal with this man she barely knew. "Thank you," she said, picking up her spoon. "This is unexpected." Morgan looked almost embarrassed. "Like I said, least I could do." They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes, the stew as delicious as it had smelled. Finally, Faith asked, "Where did you learn to cook?" "On cattle drives, mostly. Take turns with the chuck wagon or you don't eat." Morgan broke off a piece of bread. "Though my mother taught me the basics before she passed." "I'm sorry," Faith said softly. "About your mother." Morgan nodded in acknowledgement. "Long time ago now. She was a good woman, taught school in a small town in Texas before marrying my father. Never quite fit the mold of a rancher's wife, but she tried. And your father, stubborn as they come, had a small spread outside of Amarillo." Morgan's expression grew distant. "Lost it all in '73 during the panic. Banks called in loans all across the territory. He couldn't handle the shame of it, drank himself to death within a year." Faith reached across the table, briefly touching his hand. "That must have been difficult." Morgan looked down at her hand on his, something unreadable passing through his eyes. "Life out here is hard. You either bend or you break." He looked up at her. "What about you? Your father taught you medicine, you said." Faith nodded, withdrawing her hand. "He was the only doctor in 3 counties for many years. Mother died when I was young, childbirth. Perhaps that's why he was so determined I should learn medicine." She smiled faintly at the memory. "He was ahead of his time in many ways, believed women were just as capable as men if given the chance." "Wise man," Morgan commented. "He was," Faith agreed. Though many disagreed with him allowing his daughter to pursue such an unfeminine occupation. Even now, there are those in town who refuse to be treated by a woman. "Their loss," Morgan said simply, and Faith felt a warmth spread through her chest at the matter-of-fact way he said it, as if her competence was self-evident. After dinner, they sat in the small parlor, the evening growing darker around them. Faith lit a lamp, its gentle glow creating a circle of warmth in the room. Outside, the sounds of the town settling for the night drifted through the open window, distant piano music, the occasional shout of laughter, the clop of horses' hooves on the packed dirt of the main street. "Will you really leave tomorrow?" Faith asked, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. Morgan stared into the lamplight. "Staying puts you at risk." "I can make my own decisions about risk," Faith countered gently. "Your shoulder needs more time to heal properly." "Wade's men could show up any day," Morgan insisted, though there was less conviction in his voice than before. And if they do, we'll deal with it then. Faith leaned forward, her expression earnest. Morgan, you've spent your life moving on when things get complicated. Maybe just once, you could stay and see something through. Morgan's eyes met hers, and the intensity in them made her breath catch. What exactly are you suggesting, Doc? Faith felt heat rise to her cheeks. I'm suggesting that running isn't always the answer. That sometimes, facing a problem directly is better than trying to draw it away. And if that problem is a man like Randall Wade, then perhaps it's time someone stood against him properly. Faith's voice strengthened with conviction. The people of this region deserve better than to live under the shadow of his threats. Morgan studied her with newfound respect. You're suggesting taking on one of the most powerful men in the territory. I'm suggesting justice, Faith clarified. And I think that's what you want too, or you wouldn't have helped the Johnsons in the first place. A long silence stretched between them as Morgan considered her words. Finally, he said, You might be right, Doc, but it's not a fight for one wounded cowboy. Perhaps not, Faith acknowledged. But what about a wounded cowboy and a determined doctor? And perhaps others who have suffered under Wade's ambitions. The idea hung in the air between them, audacious but compelling. Morgan's expression shifted from skepticism to thoughtful consideration. It would be dangerous. Most worthwhile things are, Faith replied simply. Another silence fell, this one charged with possibility. Morgan finally broke it with a quiet laugh. You're not what I expected to find in Eureka Springs, Faith Miller. And what did you expect? Certainly not a woman doctor with more courage than most men I've known. His voice softened. And definitely not one who'd make me consider putting down roots for the first time in years. Faith felt her heart quicken at his words. Are you considering it? Maybe, Morgan admitted. Though it goes against every instinct I've developed. Sometimes instincts need to be challenged, Faith said gently. Their eyes held across the lamplight, something unspoken passing between them. The moment stretched, taut with possibility, until the distant church bell chimed 9 times, breaking the spell. Faith stood, suddenly aware of the impropriety of the situation, alone with a man who was rapidly becoming more than just a patient. It's getting late. You should rest if that shoulder is going to heal. Morgan rose as well, wincing slightly as the movement jarred his injury. You're probably right. They stood facing each other, close enough that Faith could detect the faint scent of soap and leather that clung to him. For a wild moment, she thought he might lean down and kiss her, and even more startling was the realization that she wanted him to. Instead, Morgan stepped back, his expression guarded once more. Good night, Doc, and thank you again. Good night, Morgan, Faith replied, watching as he made his way upstairs, his movements careful but still graceful despite his injury. After he disappeared from view, Faith remained in the parlor, her thoughts in turmoil. In just one day, this wounded stranger had upended her carefully ordered life, making her question the future she'd mapped out for herself. The sensible thing would be to tend his wound, send him on his way, and return to her practice safe, respectable, and alone. But as she extinguished the lamp and prepared for bed, Faith knew that sensible choices rarely led to extraordinary lives. And something about Morgan Keller made her yearn for extraordinary. Morning came with the sound of hoofbeats, multiple horses approaching at a steady pace. Faith was already up, preparing for the day, when she heard them. A glance out the window confirmed her fears. 3 riders, dusty from the trail, with the hard eyes of men who made their living with guns. She hurried upstairs, finding Morgan already awake and buckling on his gun belt, his expression grim. Wade's men, he said without preamble. 3 of them. I saw, Faith replied, her heart pounding. What will you do? What I always do, Morgan said, checking his revolver. Face them and hope I'm faster. There are 3 of them and you're wounded, Faith protested. Morgan's smile was tight. Like I said, been shot worse. He moved to the window, peering carefully around the curtain. They're checking the saloon first, won't be long. Faith's mind raced. The back door you could slip out while they're still in front. Morgan shook his head. They'll have someone watching the back. Men like these don't make amateur mistakes. He turned to her, his expression serious. Faith, when they come, you need to stay out of sight. Claim you never saw me, that I must have moved on. I will not lie while they hunt you down, Faith said fiercely. This isn't your fight. It became my fight when I pulled that bullet from your shoulder. Faith moved closer, her chin lifted in determination. Besides, I have an idea. Morgan looked skeptical but motioned for her to continue. Sheriff Dawson, Faith said. He's not like the one in Fayetteville. He's a good man, honest. If we can get word to him, even an honest sheriff can't stop what's coming, Morgan interrupted. Maybe not, but he can witness it. And testimony from a lawman about Wade's hired guns hunting a man through town would carry weight, even against someone as powerful as Wade. Morgan considered this, clearly torn between his instinct to handle the situation alone and the logic of her argument. Finally, he nodded. All right. But how do we get word to the sheriff without those men noticing? Faith smiled. Through Mrs. Peterson. She comes every morning at 8 for her rheumatism medicine. She's also the biggest gossip in Eureka Springs and lives right next to the sheriff's office. Despite the gravity of the situation, Morgan looked impressed. Clever, Doc. I have my moments, Faith replied, her smile fading as the sound of boots on the boardwalk outside reached them. They're coming. Morgan moved to position himself near the doorway, out of sight from anyone entering. When Mrs. Peterson arrives, get her that message. Until then, remember you never saw me. Faith nodded reluctantly, then hurried downstairs to open her clinic as if it were any normal morning. Her hands shook slightly as she unlocked the door, but she forced herself to appear calm. The three men approached almost immediately, the leader a tall man with a pockmarked face removing his hat as he stepped onto her porch. Morning, madam, he said, his politeness at odds with the coldness in his eyes. Wondering if we might have a word, Faith nodded, gesturing them inside. How can I help you, gentlemen? The men entered, their spurs jingling against the wooden floor. They surveyed the clinic with practiced eyes, clearly looking for signs of Morgan's presence. The leader turned back to Faith. We're looking for a man, he said. Tall fella, dark hair, probably wounded. Name's Morgan Keller. Might have come through town yesterday. Faith kept her expression neutral. I'm the only doctor in Eureka Springs. If a wounded man had come through, I likely would have treated him. And did you? The question came from the second man, shorter but with a dangerous set to his shoulders. I treated several patients yesterday, Faith replied carefully, none matching that description. The leader studied her face, clearly searching for signs of deception. Mind if we have a look around? Just to be thorough. It wasn't really a request. Faith gestured toward the back of the clinic. By all means, though I can assure you there's no one here but me. The men split up, checking the examination room, storage closets, and then moving toward the door that led to her living quarters. Faith's heart pounded as they disappeared through it, knowing Morgan was upstairs, waiting. She silently prayed he'd had the sense to find a better hiding place than standing beside the door. The bell above the clinic door jingled, and Faith nearly jumped out of her skin. Mrs. Peterson entered, right on schedule, her round face creased with a smile. Good morning, Dr. Miller, she called cheerfully. Oh my, you're looking peaked today. Everything all right. Faith had never been so grateful for the woman's predictability. Mrs. Peterson, just the person I needed to see. I have a special tincture prepared for you, but I need to fetch it from upstairs. Would you mind delivering a message to Sheriff Dawson on your way home? It's rather urgent. Mrs. Peterson's eyes lit up at the prospect of being entrusted with important information. Why, of course, dear. What shall I tell him? Faith lowered her voice. Tell him there are armed men searching for someone in my clinic, and I fear for my safety. It wasn't entirely untrue, and it would bring the sheriff running. Mrs. Peterson's eyes widened with alarm and excitement. Oh my. I'll go directly, dear, directly, Faith nodded gratefully. Thank you. Now, let me get that medicine for you. She moved toward the stairs, her heart in her throat. The sound of the men searching her living quarters continued above. As she reached the top of the stairs, she saw Morgan pressed against the wall in the hallway, his gun drawn but held close to his body. Their eyes met, and he gave her a slight nod of acknowledgement. Faith continued to her treatment room, making a show of rummaging through cabinets loudly enough for the men to hear. One of them, the third man, who had yet to speak, appeared in the doorway. "What are you doing up here?" he asked, his hand resting casually on his holstered revolver. "Preparing medicine for a patient downstairs," Faith replied, holding up a small brown bottle she'd grabbed. "An elderly woman with joint pain." The man looked suspicious, but stepped aside to let her pass. As Faith moved into the hallway, she saw the other two men emerging from the rooms they'd been searching, their expressions frustrated. "Nothing," the leader said. "Let's check the stables next." They started for the stairs, Faith following behind them with the medicine bottle clutched in her hand. She was halfway down when the front door burst open again, revealing Sheriff Dawson, his badge gleaming on his chest and his shotgun in his hands. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his gaze taking in the three armed men on the staircase. The men froze, clearly reassessing the situation. The leader recovered first, offering a disarming smile. "Just asking the doctor here about a fugitive we're tracking, Sheriff. Nothing to concern yourself with." Sheriff Dawson's eyes narrowed. "Got word there were armed men threatening Dr. Miller. That true, doctor?" Before Faith could answer, the sound of a gun being cocked echoed from the top of the stairs. Morgan stood there, his revolver aimed steadily at the leader of Wade's men. "They're looking for me, Sheriff," Morgan said calmly. "Hired guns working for Randall Wade out of Fayetteville." The situation balanced on a knife's edge. The three men were caught between Morgan above and the sheriff below, their hands hovering near their weapons. Sheriff Dawson kept his shotgun trained on them, his expression hardening. "Wade, huh?" the sheriff spat on the floor. "Been hearing his name too much lately. Boys, I suggest you lower those hands and explain yourselves." The leader's eyes darted between Morgan and the sheriff, calculating odds. "We're just doing our job, enforcing the law." "Last I checked, I'm the law in Eureka Springs," Dawson replied coldly. "And I don't recall deputizing any of you." He gestured with his shotgun. Weapons on the floor now. For a tense moment, Faith thought they might refuse. Then, slowly, the leader reached for his gun with 2 fingers, placing it carefully on the stair before him. The others followed suit, their expressions murderous. "Now," Dawson continued, "you're going to tell me exactly what business Randall Wade has sending armed men into my town." The confrontation that followed was tense, but ultimately decisive. Sheriff Dawson, it transpired, had been building a case against Wade for months, collecting testimonies from homesteaders who'd been driven off their land. Morgan's account of what happened with the Johnsons was the final piece he needed. By midday, Wade's men were locked in the town jail, and Sheriff Dawson was composing telegrams to the federal marshal's office, requesting an investigation into Wade's activities. Faith and Morgan sat in her kitchen, the danger past, but the air between them still charged with unspoken possibilities. "Seems your faith in the sheriff was well placed," Morgan said, sipping the coffee Faith had prepared. "Eureka Springs isn't like other towns," Faith replied. "People here believe in standing together against bullies, whether they wear badges or not." Morgan studied her over the rim of his cup. "You stood with me, could have turned me away, saved yourself the trouble." "I'm a doctor, Morgan. I don't turn away people who need help." Faith met his gaze steadily. "Besides, I'm not in the habit of abandoning what matters to me." The implication hung in the air between them. Morgan set down his cup, his expression serious. "I still need to go back, make sure the Johnsons are safe. Wade may be facing trouble, but his reach is long." Faith nodded, trying to mask her disappointment. "Of course, when will you leave?" "Tomorrow, if that shoulders up to it." Morgan hesitated, then added, "I was hoping you might consider coming with me." Faith's eyes widened in surprise. "To the Johnsons?" to start with, Morgan said. They could use a doctor's care. Mrs. Johnson is expecting their third child soon, and after. He trailed off, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. After, Faith prompted softly. After, I thought maybe we could see where this leads, Morgan gestured between them. Whatever this is. Faith felt a smile spread across her face. Mr. Keller, are you asking me to accompany you on an adventure? I suppose I am, Morgan replied, a matching smile tugging at his lips. Though I should warn you, adventures with me tend to involve more gunfire than might be considered proper. I'll pack extra bandages, Faith said dryly, then grew serious. What about my practice here? Eureka Springs will still be here when we return, Morgan said. If you want to return, that is. The possibility of a different future stretched before Faith, one with Morgan at her side, one where her skills might help people beyond the boundaries of this small town. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Mrs. Peterson could watch the clinic for a few weeks, she said thoughtfully. She's been assisting me with simpler cases already. Hope flickered in Morgan's eyes. Is that a yes, Doc? Faith reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. It's a let's find out, Morgan Keller, together. Morgan's fingers tightened around hers. Together sounds better than anything I've heard in a long time. The following morning, they set out just after dawn, 2 horses loaded with medical supplies and necessities for the journey. Eureka Springs was still waking up as they rode down the main street, a few early risers nodding greetings as they passed. Sheriff Dawson stood outside his office, raising his hand in farewell. Take care of our doctor, Keller, he called. And watch your back. Wade won't take this lying down. Morgan tipped his hat in acknowledgement. We'll be back before you know it, Sheriff. As they crested the hill outside of town, Faith pulled her horse to a stop, looking back at the cluster of buildings nestled in the valley. It was the only home she'd known since childhood, and leaving even temporarily filled her with a mixture of trepidation and excitement. Morgan halted beside her, having second thoughts. Faith turned to him, taking in the sight of this man who had ridden into her life barely 3 days ago and somehow changed everything. Not about coming with you, she said honestly. Just acknowledging what I'm leaving behind. Morgan nodded, understanding in his eyes. We can always turn back. Faith shook her head, smiling. No, I want to see what's ahead more than I fear leaving what's behind. She nudged her horse forward. Let's go help the Johnsons. They rode side by side along the ridge, the morning sun warming their backs as they headed west. Faith found herself studying Morgan's profile against the backdrop of the Ozark Hills, marveling at how right it felt to be here, with him, riding toward uncertainty. What? Morgan asked, catching her gaze. Just thinking about how strange life can be, Faith replied. 3 days ago, I was stitching a bullet wound in a stranger's shoulder by lantern light. Now I'm riding across Arkansas with that same stranger. Not such a stranger anymore, I hope, Morgan said softly. Faith's smile deepened. No, not a stranger at all. The journey to the Johnson homestead took 2 days, during which Faith discovered that traveling with Morgan was both more comfortable and more exhilarating than she'd anticipated. He was a considerate companion, attentive to her comfort without being condescending, and he treated her as an equal in ways few men ever had. They talked as they rode about his years drifting across the territories, about her struggles to establish herself as a doctor, about the books they'd read, and the places they'd seen. In the evenings, they made camp under the stars, and Faith found herself increasingly aware of Morgan's presence, the way firelight played across his features, the gentle strength in his hands as he tended the horses, the warmth in his eyes when they met hers. On the second night, as they sat beside the campfire after a simple meal, Morgan finally asked the question that had clearly been on his mind. Why did you really come with me, Faith? The truth. Faith considered the question, watching the flames dance before answering. Because in 3 days with you, I felt more alive than I have in years, she said finally, her voice quiet but steady. Because you looked at me and saw me not just a woman, not just a doctor, but me. She met his gaze across the fire. And because I wanted to know if what I was feeling was real or just the excitement of danger. And, Morgan's voice was rough with emotion, and I think it's real, Faith admitted. Terrifyingly real. Morgan moved around the fire to sit beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. I've spent most of my life avoiding attachments, he said softly. Seemed safer that way. And now, Faith asked, her heart beating faster. Morgan turned to face her, the firelight gilding his features. Now I'm thinking safety might be overrated. He reached up, his hand gently cupping her cheek, and Faith leaned into his touch without hesitation. When his lips finally met hers, the kiss was tentative at first, a question rather than a demand. Faith answered by sliding her arms around his neck, drawing him closer. The kiss deepened, becoming something hungry and honest, a promise of possibilities neither had dared to consider before. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, the world around them seemingly transformed by what had passed between them. I've been wanting to do that since you stitched me up, Morgan confessed, his forehead resting against hers. Faith smiled, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. I've been wanting to let you. They stayed by the fire late into the night, talking and touching, learning each other in ways both innocent and profound. By the time they finally sought their bedrolls, something fundamental had shifted between them, a commitment made without words, a future glimpsed through the veil of present uncertainties. They reached the Johnson homestead the following afternoon, finding the small farm nestled in a valley with newly planted fields surrounding a modest cabin. As they approached, a man emerged from the barn, rifle in hand, his posture wary until he recognized Morgan Keller. He called, lowering the weapon. Didn't expect to see you again, especially not with company. Morgan dismounted, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at his healing shoulder. Thomas, everything quiet since I left, Thomas Johnson nodded, his weathered face breaking into a relieved smile. Not a sign of Wade's men. Word is they ran into trouble in Eureka Springs. He glanced at Faith with open curiosity. This is Dr. Faith Miller, Morgan introduced her. She patched me up after I left here, and she's come to check on Sarah. Thomas's expression shifted to one of profound gratitude. A real doctor. Sarah will be beside herself. She's been having a hard time with this baby. Faith dismounted, already reaching for her medical bag. How far along is she? About 7 months now, by our reckoning, Thomas replied. But she's weaker than with the other two, and there's been some pain she says isn't right. Faith nodded, her professional demeanor taking over. I'd like to examine her if that's all right. Of course, Thomas gestured toward the cabin. She's inside with the children. While Faith went to tend to Sarah, Morgan helped Thomas with the farm chores, filling him in on the developments with Sheriff Dawson and the prospect of federal intervention against Wade. Thomas listened with growing hope, his eyes brightening at the possibility that their homestead might finally be secure. Never thought anyone would stand up to Wade, he said as they repaired a section of fence. Man's got half the county in his pocket. Times are changing, Morgan replied, hammering a nail into place. People are getting tired of men like Wade thinking they can take whatever they want. Thomas glanced toward the cabin, where Faith had been for the past hour. That doctor of yours, she's someone special. Morgan followed his gaze, a warmth spreading through his chest. Yeah, he said simply. She is. Inside the cabin, Faith completed her examination of Sarah Johnson, a petite woman with weary eyes but a gentle smile. The 2 Johnson children, a boy of 6 and a girl of 4, watched curiously from the corner where they'd been told to play quietly. The baby seems healthy, Faith assured Sarah, helping her sit up. But you're exhausted and showing signs of anemia, that's why you're feeling so weak. You need more iron in your diet and complete rest for at least a week. Sarah sighed, glancing at the children and the half-prepared meal on the table. Rest isn't easy to come by on a farm, Doctor. Faith smiled understandingly. I know. That's why I'll be staying for a few days to help out. She began unpacking medicines from her bag. This tonic will help with the iron, and I've brought some other supplies that should make things easier. Sarah's eyes widened with gratitude. You do that for us. Strangers? Morgan seems to think you're worth helping, Faith replied. And I've learned to trust his judgment. She hesitated, then added, besides, I've always believed that no one is truly a stranger, just a friend we haven't properly met yet. Sarah reached out, squeezing Faith's hand. Your Morgan is a good man, saved our farm, probably our lives. Thomas has been teaching him about farming, you know. He's a quick learner. My Morgan, Faith repeated softly, testing the phrase. It felt right in a way she hadn't expected. Yes, I believe he is a good man. The days that followed established a new rhythm for all of them. Faith divided her time between caring for Sarah, playing with the children, and helping with household tasks. Morgan worked the fields with Thomas, learning the intricacies of farming with an enthusiasm that surprised him. In the evenings, they gathered around the Johnson table, sharing meals and stories, building connections that grew stronger with each passing day. On their fourth night at the homestead, after the Johnsons had retired to bed, Morgan and Faith sat on the porch steps, watching lightning bugs dance in the gathering darkness. Morgan's arm was around Faith's shoulders, her head resting comfortably against him. Sarah's doing much better, Faith observed. Another week and she should be strong enough to manage on her own again. Morgan nodded, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on Faith's arm. Thomas offered me a partnership in the farm today. Faith sat up, surprised. A partnership. Said he needs the help, especially with the new baby coming, and he likes the idea of having someone around who can handle trouble if Wade tries again. Morgan's expression was thoughtful. It's good land. Could be a real home for someone willing to put in the work. Faith's heart quickened at the implication. And are you? Willing, I mean. Morgan turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. I've been thinking about what you said about not always running when things get complicated. He took a deep breath. I'm tired of drifting, Faith. For the first time in years, I'm thinking about tomorrow and the day after that, not just surviving until sundown. And what do you see when you think about tomorrow? Faith asked softly. Morgan's eyes held hers, honest and vulnerable. You, always you. The simplicity of his declaration took Faith's breath away. Morgan, I know it's fast, he continued. Too fast, probably, but when you've spent as much time alone as I have, you recognize the real thing when it finally comes along. He squeezed her hands gently. I love you, Faith Miller. And if you'd consider staying not just here, but with me, I'd spend every day trying to be worthy of that choice. Faith felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness, but from a joy so intense it was almost painful. I love you too, she whispered. And yes, it's fast, and yes, it's terrifying, but it's also the truest thing I've ever felt. Morgan's smile was radiant in the moonlight. He leaned forward, capturing her lips in a kiss that held all the promise of the future they were choosing together. When they finally broke apart, Faith rested her forehead against his, her eyes closed in perfect contentment. So what happens now? She asked. Morgan chuckled softly. Well, I accept Thomas's offer. We build a second cabin on the property, a proper one, with room for a small clinic where you can still practice medicine. His voice grew tender. And when you're ready, maybe we make it official, if you'll have me. Faith opened her eyes, meeting his gaze with a smile that answered his question before she spoke. I think Mrs. Peterson will be terribly disappointed that she won't be returning her borrowed clinic after all. Morgan laughed, pulling her close again. We can visit. Eureka Springs isn't so far. No, Faith agreed, nestling against him. And neither is our future, it seems. 2 weeks later, a telegram arrived from Sheriff Dawson. Federal marshals had arrested Randall Wade on multiple charges of fraud, intimidation, and conspiracy. His empire was crumbling, his hired guns scattered to avoid prosecution. The Johnsons' land and all the other small homesteads in the region were finally safe. That night, they celebrated. Thomas brought out a bottle of whiskey he'd been saving for a special occasion, and Sarah, now much improved under Faith's care, prepared a feast that had them all groaning with satisfaction afterward. As the evening wound down, Morgan slipped away, asking Faith to join him for a walk. He led her to a small rise overlooking the property, where the foundations of a new cabin were already taking shape. In the moonlight, Faith could make out the rough outline of what would become their home. "It's not much yet," Morgan said, a touch of nervousness in his voice. "But I wanted you to see it before I asked properly." Faith turned to him, her heart swelling with emotion. "Asked what properly?" Morgan reached into his pocket, withdrawing a small ring with a modest pearl set in silver. "This was my mother's," he explained, his voice suddenly husky. "She made me promise I'd only give it to someone who made me want to be a better man." He took Faith's hand, his eyes never leaving hers. "Faith Miller, will you marry me?" Faith felt tears spill onto her cheeks as she nodded, too overwhelmed for words at first. "Yes," she finally managed. "Yes, Morgan Keller, I will marry you." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Faith marveled at how perfectly it fit, just as she and Morgan seemed to fit together, despite all odds. He pulled her close, sealing their promise with a kiss that held all the passion and tenderness of the journey that had brought them to this moment. Later, as they walked back to the Johnson homestead hand in hand, Faith glanced up at the stars scattered across the vast Arkansas sky. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't been shot?" she asked. "If you hadn't ridden into Eureka Springs that night?" Morgan followed her gaze upward, contemplating the question. "I'd probably still be drifting," he admitted, looking for something without knowing what it was. "And now," Morgan's arm tightened around her waist. "Now I know exactly where I'm supposed to be." They were married a month later in a simple ceremony at the Johnson homestead, with Thomas and Sarah standing as witnesses and Sheriff Dawson making the journey from Eureka Springs to officiate. Faith wore a dress of pale blue, with wildflowers in her hair and her mother's locket around her neck. Morgan, clean-shaven and solemn in a new suit, couldn't take his eyes off her as she walked toward him across the sun-dappled yard. Their vows were simple but heartfelt, promises to cherish and protect, to support and believe in each other through whatever life might bring. When Dawson pronounced them husband and wife, the small gathering erupted in cheers, none louder than the Johnson children, who had adopted Morgan and Faith as honorary aunt and uncle over the weeks of their stay. The celebration lasted well into the evening, with neighbors from surrounding farms joining in as word spread of the wedding. There was music and dancing, food and laughter, and through it all, Morgan and Faith remained at each other's side, their happiness a tangible thing that seemed to infect everyone around them. As the night grew late, they finally slipped away to their newly completed cabin, small but sturdy, with a room set aside for Faith's medical practice and windows placed to catch the morning light. Morgan carried her across the threshold, setting her gently on her feet in what was now their home. "Welcome home, Mrs. Keller," he said softly. Faith smiled, reaching up to touch his face. "It sounds strange but wonderful." "Strange but wonderful," Morgan agreed, pulling her close. "That seems to describe everything about us." As they stood in the center of their new home, arms around each other, Faith thought about the unlikely path that had brought them here: a gunshot wound, stitches by lantern light, and the courage to choose love over caution. It wasn't the future she had imagined for herself, but standing in Morgan's embrace, she knew it was exactly where she was meant to be. The years that followed brought challenges and joys in equal measure. The small clinic Faith established at their cabin quickly became known throughout the region, drawing patients from as far away as Fayetteville. Morgan proved to be a natural farmer, working alongside Thomas to expand the homestead into one of the most productive in the county. When Sarah gave birth to a healthy boy the following spring, it was Faith who delivered him, her skilled hands ensuring a safe arrival that left mother and child thriving. 6 months later, It was Morgan who paced anxiously outside their bedroom while Thomas's wife assisted Faith through her own labor. Their daughter, Elizabeth, arrived just before dawn, a strong-willed child with her father's dark hair and her mother's clear blue eyes. 2 years later, they welcomed a son, Samuel, followed by another daughter, Grace, 3 years after that. Their family grew alongside their farm and Faith's practice, each addition bringing new depths to the love that had begun that night by lantern light. There were difficult times, seasons of drought that threatened the crops, illnesses that swept through the region testing Faith's skills and endurance, occasional rumblings of trouble from those who had once been loyal to Wade. But through it all, Morgan and Faith faced each challenge together, their partnership only strengthening with each obstacle overcome. By the time Elizabeth was 10, the original Johnson homestead had grown into a thriving community of interconnected farms, with the Keller cabin at its heart. Faith's clinic had expanded to include a small hospital wing where she trained local women in basic medical care, passing on the knowledge her father had once shared with her. Morgan, now respected as one of the most knowledgeable farmers in the county, often traveled to advise others on crop rotation and soil management. On the 15th anniversary of their wedding, Morgan surprised Faith with a journey back to Eureka Springs. The town had grown, now boasting a railway station and grand hotels catering to visitors drawn by the supposed healing properties of the local springs. Mrs. Peterson, now quite elderly but still the town gossip, greeted them like returning royalty, insisting on hearing every detail of their life since leaving. Sheriff Dawson, gray-haired but still sharp-eyed, joined them for dinner at the hotel, raising a toast to the most unlikely love story to ever come out of a bullet wound. They laughed together, reminiscing about those tension-filled days when Wade's men had threatened everything. Later, as they walked arm in arm through the town that had witnessed the beginning of their journey together, Morgan stopped at the building that had once housed Faith's clinic. It was now a general store, all traces of its medical past long gone. Strange to think it all started here, he mused. One desperate cowboy with a bullet in his shoulder, one determined doctor with a lantern. Faith leaned against him, her head on his shoulder. I sometimes wonder what my life would have been if you hadn't ridden in that night. Probably safer, Morgan teased gently. Certainly quieter. Faith looked up at him, the years having only deepened her love for this man who had changed the course of her life. And infinitely less wonderful. Morgan bent to kiss her, there on the street where they had first met, his touch as tender as it had been on their wedding day. No regrets, then? He asked when they parted. Faith smiled, thinking of their children waiting back home, of the life they had built together, of all the moments both difficult and joyous that had filled the years since that fateful night. Not a single one, she answered truthfully. Every stitch was worth it. As they walked back to their hotel, hand in hand beneath the star-filled Arkansas sky, Faith reflected on the strange and wonderful journey that had brought them here from strangers to lovers to partners, in every sense of the word. It had begun with blood and pain, with danger and uncertainty, but had blossomed into something neither of them could have imagined that night when she had stitched his wound by lantern light. And when Morgan pulled her close later that evening, whispering, "I've been shot worse, but I've never cared more," Faith knew that those words, spoken so many years ago, had been the beginning of the truest story she would ever know their story, still unfolding, still surprising them, still binding them together with stitches stronger than any thread.